Okay, we're going to draft a last. Basically take the three-dimensional form and flatten it into 2 dimensions. Call it drafting a last, flattening a last, shelling a last. Different terminology, all meaning the same thing. Flattening is probably the best description. We're going to take the three-dimensional shape, separate it into 3 different planes: the lateral side, the medial side, and the bottom. The first step is to divide the last into the planes that we were talking about: medial, lateral, and bottom. The bottom on this last is already divided for us because it has a feather edge, or the hard edge where the bottom meets the side of the last. So I'm going to focus on putting a center line down to divide the lateral and medial sides. I cut a small strip of masking tape. This is probably about 1/4 of an inch. And what I've done is I've drawn a line down the center. I am eyeballing this. And just kind of sight down the cone of the last, kind of going by the high spot, trying to eventually get it down the center of the toe. You don't have to really get too hung up on this process, because at the end, if there's any wavering in the center line, we're going to adjust for that later. So there's our center line for the cone. Got a smaller strip here for the heel. Peel this off. You could probably also use like automotive pinstriping tape. A very thin line that would get that on there. And I'm going to do this and I've kind of made a mess of the end here. That will be close enough. So now we have our medial lateral planes divided. I've got a piece of paper here. One thing I wanted to mention when we're dividing the planes with the center line, I make a reference point on the line, and I will mark this on as we're doing the medial and lateral side. I'll mark this point on it. I usually choose the point on the cone about where the bottom of the throat's going to be. And I do the same thing on the heel curve about where the top of the counter is going to be. It's, again, just a reference point, and we'll be seeing that later on when we line up the 2 halves. So I've got paper. This paper is just something I had kicking around. It's about the consistency of a brown paper bag that you get from the grocery store. You can use just about anything. It has to be somewhat flexible to wrap around, and it'll wrap easier than you just saw because of what we're about to do. But you could use copy paper, you could use construction paper, you could use craft paper from brown paper bag or something like that. Okay, first thing we're going to do is lay the last on its medial side, kind of center it in the paper. You want to make sure you have an inch, at least like 1.5 inches around the perimeter of the last. Just going to do a quick tracing of what we're seeing here. And hopefully you can see that. And now I'm going to cut, again, just by eye. About 1 inch to 1.5 inches. outside my little tracing there. And there we go. Now, I want to try and visualize where we're going to attach this paper to the last. And I usually go about the high point of the heel, along the top of the arch, and then along the wall of the forefoot. It's not important to me, it just works out that much better. So if I visualize those points kind of along there, now I'm going to start cutting perpendicular lines, somewhat perpendicular, starting at our tacking point out to the edge. As you go along and do this enough, you're going to come up with variants of this that you'll just discover, and it'll make it that much easier for you. And hopefully you'll share these insights with others, as people have done with me in the past, as I have done with people in the past, as I'm doing with you right now. We don't cut along the top, and you'll see why when we get to that point. This part of the last is called the island, incidentally. And in case you're ever on Jeopardy and you take a column that's something like obscure shoemaking terms for 1,000, the term last is an old Gaelic term, Gaelic or Celtic term, Anglo-Saxon, and it means a footprint or animal track. So make a mental note of that, and I'm sure you'll make Alex Trebek very happy when you come up with the answer. So we've got our our first draft prepped, and what we're going to do is attach this to the last. Okay, I've laid out some tacks here. Got my tack hammer. These are very old 2-ounce hand tacks, and I'm not sure if you can see it or not, but there's kind of like a little stab at the very end of the tack. So not all tacks or nails, small nails, are going to enter as easy as these do. Now is the time where we decide where we want this placed on the last. Of course, we want these fingers to be able to come over and reach over those lines that we've drawn. Looks like I've got that spot, and I usually start hitting one kind of in the meaty spot on the heel, and from there making sure you don't pivot this way or that way, and that you're maintaining your spot. And grab another tack, pop it in there, tap it down. In the past, instead of using tacks, I have also used a double-sided adhesive tape, and that works pretty good. Just have to be careful peeling the paper off. And actually, in some ways it works better because if you run the piece of tape right along here and you press the paper into it, the paper already starts to conform to the last. Now, I am really tight up here. I almost didn't cover, so I wasn't paying attention. I was talking to the camera instead, so let that be a lesson. And I probably don't need this one at the end, but I'm going to do it anyways. Now, we're going to go through and mark all the edges of our lateral plane. The bottom is very easy. Fold it over the edge. I usually take the edge of the paper or the edge of the pencil and slide it along the corner. That makes a nice line. Get to a spot when we're done with the feather edge and we're hooking the lines. Fold a finger over. You can fold the other ones out of the way, and you continue your line. Now, this finger covers up the reference point. So I'm not quite sure where that is. I'm going to mark an X on there. I'm going to come back later, trim that off before I remove the paper, and mark that in. This is where I ran out of line, so I'm going to wing it. And the whole process of this is to get you a starting point of the shape you need. There are also points on the island where we're not going to fold it over. You could, but I've always just held my hand up to the back and just ran my pencil along it. And when I'm trimming this off, I'll come back and I'll trim it from the back side. The same thing with this portion of the heel right here. Now we'll work our way down the cone of the last. Now I'm covering up that reference point. Can make a mark to remember to trim that off afterwards. Now, a funky part here is the toe. If you think about it, what we're doing is the impossible. We've got a three-dimensional shape that we're going to make two-dimensional. If we were to actually be able to do that, it would end up being all sliced with tiny slices. Well, we're not going to have our shoe made like that, so that's not going to happen. So it's a physical impossibility, and nowhere does that show up more than the toe, because basically you've got material coming here and you've got material coming here, and all of a sudden you end up with a big chunk of material at the toe. So what I do is I work it in both ways. From the toe, coming down, and I'm eyeballing that line as I come across. And different people will hold the paper against the last a different way, and their last will come out slightly different. And any two people drafting the same last will come out with something slightly different. If the same person drafts the same last twice, the two results will probably be a little bit different. So now as I'm coming from the bottom, I'm kind of folding my paper ahead. Trying to take it where the finger is attached up here and to get it to lay down kind of naturally. But as I said, 2D to 3D. Okay, we've got everything marked out, either on the back side or on the front side. And I'm going to take some scissors. Trim these off. So I can go back and get my reference points in there. And I'll lay that over. Pick up my reference point. Same thing in the heel. Okay, I'm going to pull the tacks. And I've got a draft. Tracing the outside, lateral side of the last. See where it rocks a little bit. I trace the back part, then rock it forward onto the forefoot. Sketch that in. That kind of gives us a little bit more of the shape that we're going to need to cut. So there's nothing worse than going to draft it, setting up your paper and everything, and then suddenly realizing the paper isn't big enough to cover the last. Imagine where the shape of your nail setting is going to be. So it's going to kind of come along here, dip down, and then go back up. And that's what I'm going to use when I'm making these cuts, especially on the lateral side. You may find that after you've got the paper tacked down, it doesn't really lay against the last well. You can always take a pair of scissors and cut the paper after it's on the last. In fact, I've seen that done by shoemakers in the past. Not my way of doing it. Seems a bit clumsy, but works for some people, then great. And again, what is important is what works for you, and that you get good results. And spread the tacks out a little bit so I can sort of sneak up on them. See, I can tell right here the paper's not going to lay down well. So I'm going to take my knife and extend those a little bit. There, it's laying down much better now. Again, making sure that I've got enough to cover everywhere. again, as I'm putting these tacks in, I'm making sure that the paper is laying flat as I go along. That's why I don't put one in the back and one in the front and then try and fill them in. I just work my way forward. And we will start our line marking on the lateral. And last but not least, we'll draft the bottom. A lot of times from a last maker, you'll receive a bottom pattern along with the last, so this is already done for you. However, if for whatever reason you don't have it, just like using the upper part, we can draft the bottom. I stay a little bit closer as I'm putting this trim margin on here because the bottom of the last is a lot more flat than the upper part, so we're not going to have as much distortion in the fingers as we fold them over. And I'm just going to make slashes radiating out. And there we are. We've got enough paper to cover the bottom. Make sure we're kind of centered there. And we'll throw a few tacks in here. Take our wonderful pencil here, and again, because we're working on that hard feather edge, the bottom usually goes pretty quick. Marking an X because I am going to use the center lines as a reference point later when I'm actually laying out a shell. Okay, I want to trim that. I also want to mark the center line at the heel. And this is where I ran out of line. So I've got to eyeball that. Let's come back to this one. And I've got the center there. Full tacks. And we've got our bottom. We start trimming off all these little fingers. To get down to our net shape. Okay, there's our bottom pattern trimmed out. We can come back to the lateral. And I'll usually start by picking up the lines that I laid in from the back. Now you'll see where this line here, as we wrap the paper around the heel of the last here, well, of course it tucked in and came down, so it actually created this line where I'm coming back out. Well, we're not going to use that line, so I run it from where I marked it. I ran it straight out. That's it from the back. Now we'll come down the front. You end up that marks are off from the one next to it a little bit. You just blend them. We'll take time to mark out the toe. We have those marks that are here because we laid the paper down in different directions. I'm going to just take my pencil and blend in where I want to cut. There's our lateral draft. Because of how I'm going to use this, in following steps, I'm just going to make a small slice along our reference points and transfer those marks to the other side because that's how I'm going to use it. Now we're up for our medial side. Again, I'm going to flip it over, start with the portion that I marked from the back. So now we have our medial draft, our lateral draft, and our bottom. And that basically reflects what we've got there in the last. The next step is to put the medial and lateral last drafts together. Okay, we'll turn these pieces of scrap paper into an actual draft now. Now carefully take your draft. I usually start with the lateral draft because it tends to be a little bit larger, so you'll be able to see around it. And just carefully run a pencil along the edges, holding them flat, making sure that they don't curl under so you don't lose any of the draft. Also mark your reference points. Alright, looks like we have a line around everything there. Now we're going to lay the medial side on there. Now, in theory, the reference points should line up right where they were, because they're meeting at the center line. There we have it. What I'm going to do now is, and you learn this just from experience, I'm going to make the heel just one. I'm going to choose that for my heel. So now I'm going to work between these 2 points, and hopefully this shows up. Split the difference all along here, up and down the back, and again the toe, I'm going to average it. I've got a discrepancy in length, and that can be from the center line being one way or the other in the heel and or in the forefoot. Going to leave these lines alone. These are the lasting lines. The differences you see there represent the distance from the center line to the outside of the last. So naturally, you see more here than you do on the medial side. So you're going to see more in the draft. And here, I'm going to blend the toe into the medial and lateral lines. And the island really doesn't make a difference because you're not really fitting the shoe to it. I'm going to cut in my lines that represent the medial lasting allowance. I'm just going to open up these small slices. That we put in. Marking through our medial spot. I'm going to push it through with a scribe also. I used to sharpen my pencils when there was a lot of doing this work by hand. When it was all done by hand, I used to sharpen my pencil to a chisel point so it could slide into slots like that easier. Oftentimes when you finish a draft, depending upon the shape of the last, oftentimes the medial arch will come quite far down in here, and it will actually drop down below the lateral side. But as you can see on this last, there's quite a bit of beef out here to the outside, so this part actually doesn't, the medial arch doesn't extend down there. Oftentimes you'll see that. So we've got medial and lateral. And this one is only a medial. So what you can do is you can take each of these patterns, cut a non-stretch textile is what I like to use. As non-stretch as you can get, I think that gives you a truer representation of what you're going to see. Take those parts, zigzag them up the heel and down the cone. Of course, leave them open at the bottom. Take that and lay it over your last. And you pull it down. Sometimes you might even want to tack it a little bit around the toe or at the heel and lay it on there, draw it out, see how it fits to the feather edge. So that's what we've got for drafting a lass. Grab some paper, some tacks, knife, don't hurt yourself, and try it out.